This is lecture 4 in the course in International Human Rights. I'll call it From Nuremberg Trials to the Yugoslav Tribunal / Banality of Evil, Radical Evil. 20th century witnessed periods of gruesome war and obviously the tragic elements of basic human rights at a political, civil way being devastated in terms of people. Europe in the 20th century, particularly with the rise of Nazism and Germany emerging in the late 20s, and certainly by 33 Hitler coming to power in Germany, and the impact on communists and Jews and many others, and then the aggressive nature of what he did as he spread National Socialism throughout Europe, and then Italy under Mussolini, the fascist tendencies, and in Spain under Franco, but certainly Germany, in terms of its aggressive Nazism and its total undermining of basic rights, played a very significant role, obviously, in World War II, as did Japan. So Japanese nationalism was also significant at this period of time in leading to World War II, and the Japanese invasion of Pearl Harbor brought the United States into the war. But as the war came to an end, one of the things that emerged in terms of human rights was putting individuals on trial for what they had done, either those who had taken leadership in their country in terms of abusing, undermining minimal human rights. And out of this came 2 trials after World War II. One was the Nuremberg Trials, which tried the Germans, particularly leadership of Germans, who are responsible for furthering Nazism. And then there were the Tokyo Trials, which tried leaders in Japan for obviously their very aggressive tendency. Now, the irony of this, of course, when we think of human rights, it was the victors who put the Germans and the Japanese on trial, and yet the victors themselves were notorious for human rights violations. So the Americans bombing Hiroshima and Nagasaki and vaporizing thousands of Japanese, the British bombing of Berlin and Hamburg and Dresden, civilian cities, which there was not any substantive military presence. And so the dilemma sometimes when we think of courts which try war crimes or war crimes tribunals is they're often skewed in a way that the victor gets to be the judge, but they themselves are not judged in terms. So the West holds high these ideals of human rights, and Nuremberg and Tokyo became 2 key litmus tests of how leaders of states would be tried, convicted for their crimes against humanity, and yet Britain and the United States were not equally tried. So there is this duplicity, and it's very important that we'll come across it again and again, that often the victor gets a pass and the loser is judged, whereas if human rights are truly universal, then both should be judged in terms of their human rights performance. And war obviously is one of those tests which we can evaluate in terms of how much people respect rights. And there was obviously no need, and it's obviously a very controversial issue, but there was no substantive need, and much research has been done on this now, no need to bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the implications of that. The Japanese were very close to surrendering, and there was certainly no need to bomb civilian cities in Germany as well. Now, what happened with the rise of the Cold War is that the Nuremberg and Tokyo trials and judging losers and victors doing so, they got eclipsed in many ways in the Cold War, even though liberal democratic traditions as well as communist traditions through client states were engaged in some horrendous human rights atrocities on both sides. And if I had time, I would go into this, looking at all the American CIA operations post-World War II that led to the undermining of political regimes, massive human rights violations in Central, Latin America, Middle East, Africa, on both sides. But neither superpowers could be brought to court because neither would allow themselves to be tried, no more than the British and the Americans would allow themselves to be tried because of their war crimes. And so what seemed to be a step forward in terms of legal human rights and war crimes became very much put in the cupboard with the door locked in the midst of the Cold War that went from pretty well 1947 to 1989. But by 1989, with the breakup, and this is where I'll move from the Nuremberg-Tokyo trials, the end of the Cold War brought a certain thaw to these questions of war crimes tribunals. Obviously, the former USSR was not going to be tried for its crimes, no more than the USA would be tried for its crimes. But with Gorbachev coming to power in the USSR, the Cold War came to an end. But one of the key thinkers post-Cold War was Samuel Huntington, and he argued that just as there was a clash of ideologies from 47 to 89, that it seemed the liberal democratic tradition had won and the communists had lost, so he warned the Americans, particularly on the Republican right, that there was going to emerge a clash of civilizations. And he listed a variety of civilizations in which the West had better prepare itself and defend itself against these emerging threats to its history. And one was, he argued, Islam, which he saw as an emerging threat to the West. He listed China, Confucian civilization. But out of that came a certain concern with the threat of Islam, and particularly what had occurred in certainly the early 1990s as Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. The Americans went in, pushed Hussein back in Iraq, but came to see very clearly, and then obviously throughout much of the 80s there was Iran, there was Saudi Arabia, obviously two different notions of Islam, the Sunni tradition, Saudi Arabia, the Shia in Iran, and then the many break-offs from these particular groups, Taliban, Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab, many groups like that, which were engaged in, obviously for the West, but was seen as terrorist threats. Now, by the late 80s, as Yugoslavia was imploding once Tito, well, the end of the Cold War, end of that unified Yugoslavia under Tito, there emerged a thinker whose history went back a long time to the Ottoman Empire and the terrible treatment of the Ottoman Turks, of the Serbs. And the whole Serbian nationalism begins to emerge under Milosevic. And under Milosevic, with the breakup of Yugoslavia, you get this brutal rise of Serbian nationalism going into Bosnia-Herzegovina, and some of the terrible atrocities that went on there, to the point where by the mid-1990s and later, NATO brings in over 60,000 troops into Bosnia-Herzegovina to deal with this nationalism and Milosevic. And underneath Milosevic's, by the late 80s and 90s, his argument, he very much built on Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, in which he argued the Muslims have been a threat. They brutalized the Serbian Orthodox. They brutalized the Serbian people. And Bosnia-Herzegovina was historically a very multi-ethnic state, as well as many of these other multi-ethnic states in terms of Kosovo, Croatia, Albania. And he took the position following Huntington that he had to be part of purging the Muslim horde, the aggressive Muslims who had brutalized the Serbians, and restore Serbian Western Christianity and Western culture to its prominent place once again. And throughout the 1990s, both in Bosnia-Herzegovina, Srebrenica was one of the most terrible atrocities in 95, and the ongoing rapacious nature of Milosevic and those who followed him. The West realized that this was not a clash of civilizations, and Milosevic certainly did not represent Western liberal democratic tradition contra Islam. This was a clash between a brutal form of Serbian nationalism, that Islam was not the enemy, it was he had to be dealt with because he was certainly not a liberal Democrat. So throughout most of the 1990s, the West, via NATO, the Dayton Accords, they began to bring troops, UN, NATO working very, very closely together, bringing troops into Bosnia-Herzegovina. And just as in Nuremberg, and just as with the Tokyo trials, with the end of the Cold War, the belief was the UN, working with NATO, could deal with Milosevic and put him on trial. And hence this is where you then get the Yugoslav Tribunal, which was bringing again aggressive nationalist Serbs to trial. And through a series of both special forces operations, they managed to track down many of the leaders who were under Milosevic and others, and brought them to trial as an attempt to kickstart the Nuremberg Tokyo tradition and this horror in terms of Sarajevo in Bosnia-Herzegovina, one of the most lovely cities, obviously, in Eastern Europe, Sarajevo, and under the Serbian nationalist under Milosevic, the city was devastated in Sniper Alley, and thousands of people were killed. And it was largely through the UN and NATO that, in fact, bit by bit, these leaders, just as the German leaders were brought to the dock, and just as the Tokyo leaders were brought to the dock, now these Serbian nationalists were going to be brought to the dock and tried under international law and crimes against humanity in war. So when we think then of the role of human rights and law, there's always this tension that has to be pondered. And going back to the trial of the Germans and the Japanese, why is it that some people are tried who obviously should be tried, but the victors who have committed equally serious crimes are let off the dock? And so when we move forward then into the, well, obviously the crimes of the Cold War, 1947 to 1989, and the many deaths that occurred there, no one was brought to trial because of the Cold War. Nobody had the upper hand to try anyone. And so many felt that with the Yugoslav Tribunal, in fact, there was actually force being, it wasn't just documents about human rights, it wasn't just the UN talking diplomatically about human rights, there was teeth put on these rights. And so, as I mentioned earlier, with the Serbian nationalists, special forces actually went in, tracked down, and found these people who were leading and perpetuating these terrible atrocities. So it was a euphoric era in the 1990s in which there not only was legal documents in place, in which the UN was willing to talk about this, but also there were states acting on this. Now, there was often the concern is why did the First World, particularly leaders of the First World, act the way they did in Eastern Europe, but similar atrocities were going on in the Middle East, similar atrocities were going on in Africa, similar atrocities were going on in Asia. And these questions were legitimately asked, is why do we prioritize certain areas where obvious human rights are being violated through various types of ethnic nationalism, but in other parts of the world, and obviously what's often referred to in comparison to the Yugoslav as Rwanda. Now, of course, the Rwanda thing happened so quickly between the Hutu and the Tutsi, unlike a stretched out period of time with the Serbian nationalism under Milosevic and his henchmen and killers in that sense. But certainly our own Canadian Romeo Dallaire was caught between a rock and a hard place in Rwanda, which we'll be dealing with the following week in the human rights situation. So comparing the Rwanda situation to the Yugoslav is very significant, but it's a very, very different context historically, and one happened at a hyper-accelerated pace. The other dragged on, but both are situations of the failure, in some ways, of the First World to act in dealing with these, even though the Yugoslav situation was finally dealt with. But as I mentioned earlier, one of the major concerns is, if we just put Rwanda in brackets for the second, why were not other equally horrendous situations in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia not being dealt with, in which some of the crimes against humanity and the human rights violations were equally significant. So when we think then of, and particularly Lecture 2 in the book you'll be reading, which focuses on the whole history of Nuremberg, Tokyo, Yugoslav Tribunal, important to get a sense of how the language of human rights is held high, but it's often selectively embodied in terms of courts, who's tried, and which countries will be focused on in terms of dealing with where there are human rights violations. But there can be no doubt throughout the 1990s, and Canada obviously was a peacekeeping mission in Bosnia-Herzegovina at that particular time also. And so when again we look at then human rights internationally, our readings for this week are Chapter 2, which tends to focus explicitly on the Yugoslav situation of the 90s. Milosevic died after he was about to be condemned through trials in 2006 of a heart attack, and there was jubilation, as amongst many others who were tried and convicted in the streets of Sarajevo, and their one of the most exquisite libraries in the world, which had been destroyed by the Serbian nationalists. The city, obviously, in Sarajevo has been rebuilt, but the memory of that tragedy lingers. So when we think international human rights, to be pondering and reflecting on why certain places are acted on, why other places are not, and what's the ideological reason for that.